Lisa Anderson. I'm currently employed as the president of the American University in Cairo. I became president on the 1st of January 2011, right before the revolution there. Before that, I was at the American University in Cairo as provost or chief academic officer. And before that, I spent 25 years at Columbia University in New York. I am a political scientist, and I was dean of the School of International Public Affairs.
As we started talking before the interview, it come to my knowledge that you basically were in the region before and studying the region from, let's say, a long time ago.
A long time ago, exactly. The first time I ever visited anywhere in the region was here in Tunisia. I came to study Arabic at the Bourguiba School, and then a few years later I came back to do research on my doctoral dissertation.
So now that you're back in the region and in a time where the region is really facing a historic moment in its long history, what's your reading? How are we doing so far?
I think the initial enthusiasm and the expectation that things would be easy has worn off everywhere. It's clear that a transition to an accountable government that is relatively transparent to the citizens and so forth is going to be a long, complicated process everywhere. That said, I am enormously optimistic about this in the medium term, because I think there is a permanent change in the culture of political expectations in these countries. So, as the Egyptians always say, they've lost their fear. And when you say that about Egypt, which was so classically the most passive population and so forth, I think that's true across the region. Now, you need more than foolhardiness to run a country. It's not just losing fear. But I think that change is a permanent change. It means people see themselves as citizens rather than subjects. And that is what will ultimately prevail as new institutions are built. So I am optimistic in the long
run. Can you first introduce us a little bit to AUC and then elaborate on the place of AUC during this period of transition?
AUC was established in 1919, which makes it the third oldest university in Egypt after Al-Azhar, which is, of course, ancient, and Cairo University, which had been established only 10 years earlier. And I always remind everyone that 1919 in Egypt was, of course, one of the Egyptian revolutions. So in a sense, we were born with a revolutionary mission, if you will. And it really was from the very beginning to be of service to Egypt and the region. And how service was understood changed over the course of time because, of course, Egypt changed and Egypt's needs changed. But in recent years, that was very much interpreted as to be a university that produced some of the leaders of the country and of the region, and to provide a vehicle for leading-edge scientific and scholarly research. And I think we've done that. And if you see the prominence of AUC alumni in the revolution itself, you can see that we really were producing the next generation of talented, dedicated, committed citizens of Egypt. And that's really what we think we should be doing going forward as well. We had a campus, our only campus for a long time was on Tahrir Square, so we had very much a window onto the revolution. We have a brand new, 4 years old campus in suburban Cairo now, completely purpose-built, all brand new everything's. Classrooms are all smart classrooms, the technology is all there, the labs in engineering are fabulous and so forth. So in a sense, we have the best of all worlds right now because we have spectacular facilities out of the heat of political contention, but we also have our long-standing commitment to a presence downtown where all of our continuing education programs are run and so forth. So we anticipate being, involved in Egypt's future for another 100 years, and to be contributing positively to these developments.
AUC campus, AUC, the activity, I would say, is known among Egyptians to be a place where freedom of expression prevail, where everyone is accepted. Do you see that we we're seeing that space, I would say, threatened during these times, or no?
I actually don't think so. I mean, I think what's happened certainly in Egypt is that the way to manage those freedoms is still being established by people. So just as you sort of lift the lid on something, it boils over a little bit and then settles down to simmer the way it ought to. So in a sense, the lid was lifted, and there's been an excess of enthusiasm and an excess of use of these freedoms and so forth in some respects. So many of the universities in Egypt saw students demanding the removal of the presidents and demanding election and so forth. And we didn't see quite as much of that because we don't operate as a public university in the same way. But we saw some of it. And I think what we're seeing across the country, in a sense across the region, is to be able to utilize those freedoms effectively and responsibly does require something of a system. And that's the stage we're at now. So our students for decades had an elected student government and did have far more freedoms than their counterparts in other universities in Egypt did. And in some respects, as a result of that, they've been very involved in the revitalization of the Egyptian Student Union as a national enterprise and so forth. But even we find that the students will be, I mean, they did close our campus for a week in September as a, as I say, I think sort of an excess of enthusiasm to demonstrate that they were with their colleagues in other universities and so forth. So there's a turmoil even at AUC, but I do think that we continue to represent in society the kind of institution that most other universities would aspire to in terms of a good relations with our students and a quality faculty and a sense that we do for our students what will make them successful professionals and responsible citizens.
As a president of one of the leading universities in the Middle East and North Africa, but also as a woman, how do you see the role that women are playing now in the Arab Spring, but also the threat that women is facing now in this period of turmoil?
Well, I often remind people when they worry about the status of women that when you saw the collapse of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, you also saw a decline in the access of women to positions of public authority and so forth. In other words, there is an artificial affirmative action for women in authoritarian regimes sometimes. So there was in the Egyptian parliament, there was a quota for women. So, you sort of sense that maybe things were better for women under the old regime, but insofar as it was a quota, insofar as it was artificial and so forth and so on, it wasn't necessarily sustainable. So you do see a decline in the status of women and their access to some of these positions. So there are virtually no women in the parliament, or there were virtually no women in the parliament that was elected last spring. At the same time, I think the achievements that women will have now and going forward will be genuine and will be sustained. It's the same thing with any kind of rights. People don't give you rights, you demand them. That's history. I mean, that's always been the way rights were ever. So we didn't, sit around in the United States and wait for the King of England to give us rights. We had a revolution and demanded them. I think that's true in general of citizens. I think it's going to be true of women, that they have to be organized and demand the rights that they think they deserve. I think there is a debate everywhere now, as there was in Eastern Europe and as there will be going forward in this region, about how to balance the public role that women can play and often want to play with the expectations of the roles they'll play at home. But again, that's happening everywhere. That's certainly not unique here. It's a debate that's had in the United States all the time. Should you stay home with your children or should you work? It's a good question. But there's no universal answer to that question, and there's not even a national answer to that question. And those kinds of debates will be had everywhere.
As an American scholar based in Cairo, but also as a Columbia alumnus, how is the collaboration going between AUC and scholars on the East Coast or in the rest of the United States?
I think we have a wonderful network, actually. And when you think about higher education in the next 25 years, I think the best institutions will be those institutions that are nodes in networks. So you can't be isolated anymore, and you have to have research collaborations that transcend your institution, because no matter how good your facilities are, science is done in teams now. Research is really a global project. So we have increasing numbers of sort of thick relations with different schools, with different research clusters and so forth, not only in the United States, but our business school has a network which ranges from Northwestern in Chicago to the National University in Singapore and to INSEAD in France and so forth. So, and that's just an example. And I really do think that one of the wonderful things that the American University in Cairo can do is bring people to Cairo. And then, of course, we have relations with Egyptian universities as well. So we represent sort of a hinge or a way of moving people's ideas out of Egypt and other people's ideas into Egypt and developing these kinds of networks around the world. We can do that because we operate in English, and that makes it just more easy and accessible to many of the rest of the other. And that's one of the ways, actually, I think we will be of service, is to be able to make Egypt more transparent as a research community and to make the rest of the world more accessible to that research community. So I think we are, obviously you can always have more relations, but I think what we're doing now is precisely that kind of thickening those relationships. Not only with the United States, we tend to, because of our name, we tend to think American, but we're working more and more with Europeans, more and more with Sub-Saharan Africa, more and more with Asia.
I feel that face-to-face networks are important, but at the same time we're seeing a trend among leading universities in the rest of the world that the future of education is going to be online. And we're seeing sites like Coursera who are now offering classes from pretty much the biggest universities in the world. How AUC is going to face that?
I think we have faculty who are interested in what we call blended learning. In other words, you use some materials online, you participate in online teaching and so forth. We have a lot of participation in global classrooms and so forth. I don't think any of us, and certainly I, do not believe that in the long run education will not involve face-to-face interactions. The debate part of education, the trying out new ideas, the efforts to simply, we all know when we went to school, sitting around the lab, trying to figure something out and so forth and so on. It didn't happen online. And there will always be that part of learning and that part of research. So I think what we think is that, again, if we have these relations with other networks, much of that conversation will take place online. It will become increasingly technologically sophisticated, but there will never be a university that is a really good educational institution or a first-class research operation that will not have a campus.
You're in Tunisia today. Does AUC have any relationship with faculty or scholars in Tunisia? Do you have any activities in Tunisia?
Not very many, and that's certainly something we would like to explore. We have stolen a couple of wonderful Tunisian faculty, so we have opportunities there. Actually, our Tunisian faculty are in economics and mathematics, which is an interesting perspective that we might be able to develop some work in financial economics and so forth with colleagues here in Tunisia. But as it stands now, as these things often begin, it will begin with personal relationships, and somebody at University X and you start developing those relations and they build into institutional ties.
I can tell you that there is a huge demand for English-speaking universities and the style of American education that AUC has offered. but this is off the record.
This is wonderful to hear.
So you're here for a conference that talks about the university, the relationship between the university and the nation. How do you see that relationship going in Egypt?
Well, I think there are two elements to this. One of which is, I don't think, as people at the conference have already observed, that there is a country that is genuinely prosperous and where people are genuinely content in their sort of social and political roles as citizens that does not have strong universities. And I think strong universities require a measure of academic freedom. Those things just go together. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that university life, whether it's student mobility, whether it's research networks and so forth, can't be tied to an individual country. So you have to be able to go out of, take the risk to go out into global research networks. You send your students off to other places. You support your researchers moving into research collaborations and so forth, knowing that what they bring back to the country is going to be the kind of innovation and invention that will strengthen the economy, create more sophisticated citizens and so forth. So yes, it drives national development, but only if it is not tied directly to national development.
I know that our interview is getting longer and longer, but I'm fascinated. So I would like to ask you as a last question to give us a Tunisia versus Egypt 101. So if you have to explain to Egyptians what's the difference between Tunisia and Egypt, or the opposite to Tunisia, so how would you define that?
Well, I actually think right now, I mean, clearly there are parallels, and political scientists have remarked on the parallels since the 19th century that the French and the British went into Tunisia and Egypt at about the same time. The Destour Party and the Waft Party were established at debates about the same time. So there are really interesting historical parallels. And in fact, the sort of falling into unhappy, pointless, non-ideological authoritarianism also happened, oddly, at the same time. So there was the enthusiasm of the nationalist movement here in the 50s and 60s, as there was in Egypt in the 50s and 60s, and the last 30 years have not been very productive in either country. I have to say, and I often remark on this to my Egyptian colleagues, I think the Ben Ali government was far more damaging to Tunisia than the Mubarak government was to Egypt. And the corrosive effect of that government in Tunisia is palpable when you walk around this country. Tunisia should be much more prosperous than it is now. Tunisians should be much more content in their own skin than they are now. And that, I have to say, can only be attributed to a government that was so self-absorbed that they completely forgot why they were the government. And in that sense, however much one might fault Mubarak and might fault some of the people who are around him and so forth and so on, and there's plenty of fault to find, there was never that complete neglect of what the ordinary Egyptian needed. So I think that's surprising to me, since I was a great admirer of Habib Bourguiba in his heyday, and I thought Tunisia had enormous potential, and I still think that. But the corrosive effect of the Ben Ali regime is much greater than I would have anticipated.